physical. And I repeated those kinds of experiments a lot until that became a fact for me. Now, I understand that things that are a fact for me are not necessarily a fact for anybody else. Everybody else who hears this hears an opinion, not a fact. And that's as it should be. I tell people, if it's not your experience, then it can't be your truth. But there's no reason that you can't have the experience that gives you that truth. That's why I started teaching people how to do paranormal things, because they wanted to find those facts out for themselves. So, in any case.
Have you ever had debates with people about this? People that are like rational, sort of believe in like the fundamental reality that most people accept?
Sure.
What are those conversations like? Have you ever been persuasive to these people to have them open up their perspective and perhaps take these things into consideration?
Yeah. The people, I published a paper in a peer-reviewed quantum physics journal about experiments that would help, just straightforward quantum experiments that would help provide evidence for this. And there's several experiments. I got one finished, and I've got several more yet to do. And on that paper, I've got a guy from Caltech, mathematics. I've got a guy from JPL, physicist. So yes, I run into people and I talk to people who have, good scientific credentials and so on. And it splits two ways. If they're open-minded enough to consider it, they always come over to my side and say, "That's fantastic. I understand. That solves a whole lot of problems for me." If they are not open-minded enough to consider it, and they have the attitude, impossible, totally impossible. Reality is physical. Materialism is the only correct way. And then they just can't accept it. Now, when I ask them what do you find wrong with it? They'll say, about this, and I'll explain why that's not a problem, and so on. I can answer all the problems. And eventually they just say, I don't want to talk about it anymore. It's just impossible. And they walk away. So that's the way that goes. And I would encourage you, if I say anything to you that you feel is not, rational or doesn't make sense or somehow doesn't follow logically, please, this is the Joe Rogan Show. Shout, "Bullshit! I didn't get that. I don't see how you got from there to there." Because I can tell you, and I can tell you in a rational, logical way.
Well, I believe you. I'm following your rational, logical way.
Now, I'm just skipping over the highlight. There's lots and lots of detail, but I'm just skimming from this point to this to the next, and so on. But what happens is I can derive physics with this. I can understand quantum physics. I can tell you why the speed of light has to be a constant. I can tell you why.
Why does the speed of light have to be constant?
Because this is a virtual reality. In a virtual reality, there's this grid, and the resolution of the virtual reality is basically determined by the smallest pixel. So the smallest pixel of distance is, say, delta x, and we'll call that Planck's length. And the smallest pixel of time is delta t. We'll call that Planck's time. Now that's the good work. That specifies, the number of pixels that you got in here, the density of the pixels. Now, you take delta x divided by delta t, you get the speed of light. What that says is, as fast as you can move through space is 1 pixel of distance for every cycle of time. You can't go there. The only other way you could go would be to teleport. You're here, and now you're going to jump 10 pixels of distance in 1 unit of time. Well, that's just disappearing here and appearing over there. That's not a good virtual reality. It's a squirrely reality where it's hard to say what's,
But isn't that the reality of quantum physics? Like when you're dealing with particles that exist and don't exist at the same time, they're like particles in superposition, quantum particles that are attached.
No, all of that's done in probability. They have a probability to be different places. So it's all part of the probability. Yes, they have a certain probability to be here, a certain probability to be there, a certain probability to be some other place.
An entanglement.
And entanglement's simple. It's a if-then statement. If this changes state from a spin up to a spin down, well, the one it's entangled with over here goes from a spin down to a spin up, because there's a conservation of angular momentum in these spins. You get angular momentum from a spin, and you get angular momentum this way, and it has to be if one's up, one's down, then you have a conservation. The actual angular momentum is zero. If I change this one, now it's changed the angle of patterns of sequences. It can more complexity. What that does, and that's when regular time was invented. It's a technology that consciousness creates. So then we have it growing. It's more and more order. And of course it's learning as it goes, because arithmetic is a natural for this thing, right? I've got one thing, I've got two things, I've got another two things, oh, I've got four things, I mean, that's just natural. So it's going to explore that. It's going to get good at math and so on, just kind of naturally. So it's growing. It gets to a point where it's stalled out again. It hits another plateau. It's this one big monolithic consciousness now that has thought of just about everything that it can think of. It's because it's just one thing, and it realizes
I never thought that you could sit with yourself. Now you just need to fade away. Now you just need to fade away. Anyway, you saw it. It was locked from within. Now you're just going to fade away. Yes, I think you've got to fade away. Breaking through jagged windows and coded cipher to get to me. Am I just going would say. From now until doomsday, I'll be the albatross that hangs. Let it hang 10,000 fathoms underneath. Can you feel my hand? They're keeping me safe when I can't see through a dim parliament of watchful eyes. again. Tell me how you reason what I can't handle. No haven for the flammable wax, the medical spell, the famine pulse, incarcerated. Sometimes I burn numb to the surge of the toughest love. Pinprick my arms, carving my chest. I gotta get out of here. Oh, they don't want you to know. They hide what you see. All the people you hurt if you refuse to cue the sun. There's a man infiltrated, decimated by the mask I always wore. There's a man infiltrated, decimated by the mask I hope you know. They don't want you to know. They hide what you see. All the people you'll hurt if you refuse to kill the sun. They don't want you to know. They hide what you see. All the people you'll hurt if you refuse to kill the sun. Just because I see light around in your blinded soul. Just because God watches His love, I'm looking for fractions in time to keep me paralyzed, to get me unself. Breaks the brain myself. It's not